All right, for those just joining, I wanted to reintroduce myself. I'm Annie Olish. I'm with IDM Works. We are excited to partner with Ping today and bring you our IAM Pro series, The Power of CIAM. Dustin Maxey will be our featured speaker. He is the Director of Product Marketing at Ping. And Dustin, whenever you're ready, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about the power of customer identity with you all. So as you mentioned, my name is Dustin Maxey. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Ping. And I'm a marketing guy who also knows a little bit about identity. So I get that identity use cases, specifically for customer identity, they're important to solve. And it takes PIPs and PAPs and LDAPs and IDPs and SPs and OIDC and all the other acronym soup that comes with identity to solve them. But I also understand that my business brain does not get those things, right? Those are not only going to go over the heads of the business side of the house, but they're going to be largely irrelevant to them. So what I want to talk to you about today is I want to talk to you about how to articulate the value of customer identity. But even more than that, I want to talk to you about how to actually calculate it, how to give you some hard numbers that you can take to your business and say, look at this, through some simple math, I can show you how identity can really move the needle by X amount of dollars for your organization. And there's a lot of benefit to being able to have that conversation. It gains your identity initiatives the recognition, funding, priority. It enables you to unify, the organization around identity. Funnily enough, I was just talking to a CISO this morning of a company, and I told him about this presentation, and he said, "Oh yeah, like for my organization, in order for me to unify the business around identity, I had to really step back and talk about things like faster time to market. I had to talk about the value that it was going to get for the business. And if I hadn't done that, what would have happened would have been that all these different pieces of the organization would have gone in different directions, right? Some would have grabbed a marketing-oriented SMB identity solution. Some of them might have done a DIY solution, and we would have had a big mess of identity. So that's just one example that I thought was pertinent this morning that I ran into, where is an example of how this type of conversation can be really, really powerful for customer identity. If I can change slides here, there we go. So before we dive in, let's first get into a business mindset. So what you see on the screen here is a picture of a user journey. This one goes from awareness to advocacy. It's a pretty common representation of a user journey, but these are the types of things that businesses think about, right? How do we move people from one phase of the next to this user journey? And the objective there is because the further along they get, the closer to advocacy that a customer gets, the more money that they're going to spend with the business and the more revenue that they're going to generate, right? This is a common concept in businesses. I would argue that there is a customer identity journey that supports this process, that there's identity interactions at every step of the way as you go through this user journey. So what that allows us to do is extrapolate that identity specific journey to show the business how identity interacts across this user journey and give a foundation to start a discussion with the business about, hey, here's the types of things that customer identity affects along the path of whatever, the specific user journey for your business looks like. The concepts are the same, right? You want to move people through it as seamlessly as possible. And the other concept that's the same is that they understand that this type of user journey and the transition through it can generate revenue for the business. So what I want to do is a couple of things. I want to step through this user journey and I want to identify, what these identity interactions are. But more than that, secondly, I want to talk about how these interactions generate value for the business. So if we focus on the beginning of the user journey, I like to think of this as acquisition and retention. This is the part of the journey where your customers are introduced to your brand, right? The first impression, via registration that's either first or very early in the process, or every subsequent interaction that often requires authentication, managing their data, authenticating to support, things like that. So when you zoom in on this area of the user journey, let's ask the second question first. What's the business value? One of those values is what you see at the top above the green line there. It gets you more customers. It's the business's job to get people to a registration page. And if you look at, there's a lot of companies out there. If you look at companies like Disney Plus, if you show up to their site, there's no other option. It's register, log in, or bust. That's it. So, you know, a lot of times that is a big gate to interaction and to revenue with organizations. And if from a customer identity perspective, you can't make a great first impression, consistent registration, create, you know, great UIs, no confusion about, you know, which service they're trying to register for, then that's going to cause abandonment. And those are going to be customers and revenue that the business is never going to have. On the same token, another piece of business value here is more interactions. So what businesses will typically do, you know, a lot of your business counterparts will assign value to interactions. Like I might say as a business that every time a customer interacts with my digital properties, that's worth 50 cents, or that's worth $1 or $10, varies depending on the industry. But they can kind of average it out and determine how much an interaction is worth. Like registration, sign-on stands in the way of those interactions. So if you can't enable things like seamless, you know, single sign-on, or if it's cumbersome in any way, and there's a lot of abandonment, they're losing out on interactions and the associated revenue that that are never going to occur because of the sign-on process. So that was a very identity-centric view of the world. Again, I want to back it out, and you know, we talked a little bit about abandonment in both of those processes. So I want to back it out and talk about how businesses might look at abandonment as a whole. They see things like abandonment on the homepage because of the design, abandonment because of the usability of the product, you know, shopping cart abandonment when making a purchase, support calls, registration and authentication are in there, but this list is by no means comprehensive. It's probably a much longer list, so much so that businesses may not even understand the impact that registration and authentication plays in this trend of abandonment that they're actively trying to reduce. So what's important for us as identity professionals to do to advocate identity and convey this conversation is to zero in on that and say, hey, look, you know, we're seeing drop off from registration and authentication, and it's affecting things in the ways that I just talked to you about, right? It's customers we'll never have, and it's interactions that we'll never have, and revenue associated with both of those things. And by the way, these percentages that you see on here, these are, while not representative of any one customer, these are definitely representative of conversations we've had, right? So that 12 and 14% is not just pulled out of the air. And neither are this 3 and 4% that identity can help take away, right? It can reduce the abandonment to 3 and 4%. That's a 9 and 10% reduction. And the cool part about communicating this is that even if the person that you're talking to is not an identity professional, I guarantee you they are a consumer. So they'll get it. They'll inherently get that, you know, SSO having one set of credentials to sign on with, social registration, social login, passwordless, pixel perfect UIs, registering with a third-party IDP. I'll caution you, don't use the term IDP. Acronyms are like a danger zone, but instead maybe give an example. HBO Now and HBO Max, right? Those are two companies. I think HBO Now was first and then HBO Max. You know, HBO Max was newer, and there's already millions of customers on HBO Now. What if instead of creating a new account, they could just sign on with HBO Now to HBO Max, right? How much more adoption, how many more users do you think they would get? Those type of examples are going to resonate with people as business owners and as consumers. So they'll get it, and this is a pretty easy conversation, I think, to get them to buy into. So if you look at the middle part of the user journey here, this is, I like to think of this as what happens after authentication and registration, right? And it's, again, you know, self-service, support, personalization, right? How do you personalize across channels? And if we go back to our two questions, right? What are the identity interaction points and what is the value of those interaction points to the business? I would point out two things. One is loyalty. Loyalty is a common term within businesses, and there are specific numbers, and we'll get to some of those later, about how much more a loyal customer spends than a non-loyal customer. So if you can convince the business that identity plays a role in loyalty by creating richer customer profiles, by having a consistent view of the customer across all of your applications and channels, right? That feeds into loyalty, and loyalty equals revenue. There's proven statistics that we've kind of worked into the calculator that I'll show you at the end here. that can put hard numbers on that for you. And the second one would be cross-sell revenue. And in the same way as loyalty, right? This is the opportunity for for businesses to actually make more cross-sells and upsells by ensuring, that preferences are consistent across channels and that all apps can leverage those preferences. So I'll give you an example of the latter, the cross-sell stuff. So applications need to store data about users, right? They've got to store very specific stuff that may only be relevant to their application. It might be an unstructured JSON blob of preferences. It could be custom attributes, opt-out data, whatever else an app needs to store. And not only does it have to be able to store them, but it also has to be able to do it without, cumbersome database management processes and migrations slowing them down. Application teams do not like to be slow. So they've got to be able to store it and they've got to be able to do it easily. And if they can do that, then you can leverage a common set of preferences across channels. And the best part about it is that all of the applications that you have can leverage this data. So here's an example, right? A customer logs onto the mobile app and that mobile app collects preferences. And then on another application, on the e-commerce application, you can display, hey, you may also like these items that you purchased in your shopping cart, and you can collect more preferences. And that in turn allows you to cross-sell and upsell on other channels. So the last part of the user journey here before we get all mathy, and I may not have included this 2 years ago, trust and privacy. Customers are becoming more concerned with privacy because of things like CCPA and GDPR. And this section of the user journey is where we can build trust. And again, the value and how identity plays into it. Trust has a very similar value proposition to loyalty, right? Customers that are loyal and trust you tend to spend more money with your brand. So if you can give customers control and insight over their data and how it's being used, right, that contributes to trust and that contributes to revenue. Regulatory compliance kind of goes hand in hand with trust. That's another value to the business. Of course, it saves you from fines and things like that, but enforcing consent and complying with those regulations also facilitates more trust. It just helps you be a good steward of user data. That builds trust, that builds revenue. So these are kind of some of the valuable parts of this user journey that you can turn into conversation pieces that will resonate with businesses. So I'll go into a few examples before we get into the calculator here of how identity can help out with trust. And I think it's on two fronts. The first one is, how do you collect consent, right? And I can tell you the ideal way not to collect consent is in an encyclopedia-like privacy policy, right? You can do it that way. And I guess, that's okay if you have a customer agree to it, but it doesn't build a very trusting relationship. There are better ways to do it that identity can enable. For example, you can have, like you see on the left here, just on and off switches that easily allow customers to set in their preferences which applications can access, which attributes or access their personal data. But even better than that, I would say identity can also enable something like on the right, where whatever action the customer takes, where it requires them to share their data with a partner or something like that, you can ask them just in plain English, hey, is it okay if we share this data? And you can collect consent that way. So the collection of the consent is one way that identity helps. But the real magic, I think, of identity comes with centrally enforcing consent, because you can collect consent until you're blue in the face. But if you're a compliance team who's not very technical, how are you going to ensure that your, few or dozens or more customer-facing applications aren't making API calls that request data that is not compliant or that the customer hasn't consented to? You're not going to go in and audit the code. And then what if there's change to consents? Are you going to go in and ensure that they've all updated their API calls? It can be really, really cumbersome, and it all just goes towards kind of, degrading some of that trust that you might be able to build up with customers that ultimately equates to revenue. So the way that identity can help is a user accesses an app, that app requests data, and then centralized policies that the compliance team has insight into ensure that applications don't have to change their API calls. They don't have to change their code. No application code has to be audited. They can request whatever data they want to, but bottom line is only compliant data is going to be returned. So there's no chance of an application doing something that a compliance team doesn't have insight to that can return non-compliant data. So that's kind of all of this. We got a little bit into the weeds there, but all of this stuff goes towards building trust. And like I said, building trust and everything else that we talked about, all the other value to the business, go into earning revenue. So we talked about in that last section kind of the how, right? We talked about the how customer identity provides value and what that value is. But what I want to do now is talk about how to calculate it. It looks really nice with a bunch of dollar signs flying out of that user journey, but if you want to have a real powerful conversation with those businesses, you want to turn those dollar signs into actual numbers that you and the business, work through together, and they might say, oh, wow, this is a bigger impact on customer experience, on revenue, et cetera, than I imagined customer identity being able to have. What do you need? So it's really important to be able to do that. So before we get into some example calculations that I want to run you through, I want to talk about our methodology, right? So what we did was we started with the CLV, the customer lifetime value. And the customer lifetime value of an organization is a metric that's pretty common to businesses. And it what it does is it helps businesses assign how much is this customer going to be worth over the 10 or 20 or 15, however long years that they're going to likely remain with the organization. And that number you can see in the example here, it's $14,000. This is a tried and true variable and a tried and true way of calculating it for organizations. And so a lot of the things that go into that calculation are things like, what's your customer lifespan? Is it 10 years? Is it 20, 30? What's the retention rate? How often do you lose customers? Profit margin? How frequently do customers visit? Things like that. So once we have that number, the second step is to go and look at how identity impacts those variables. So take customer visit frequency, for example. We already talked about how sign-on can affect customer visit frequency. Other things that go into it are the number of customers and your retention rate or your growth rate. We already talked about how registration can affect the growth rate. So if we can take a pragmatic look at identity and then go and recalculate over here on the right in step 3, the customer lifetime value based on those identity improvements, we can see a different result. And what that allows us to do is a few things. It allows us to talk to the business about how much more is your customer lifetime value? It was $15,000 before. Has that gone up by 5%, 10%? Is it $16,000 now? How much more can you spend to acquire a customer because of that increase in customer lifetime value? It also allows us to calculate increased projected revenue. So if we were to apply these customer identity enhancements, what might your revenue look like next year? Would it raise it by 2%, 3%, 4%? By X amount of dollars? So it allows us to calculate those things, as well as how does it grow your customer base? How many more customers are you going to have next year than you had projected because of customer identity? These are all metrics that move the needle for the business, and they're things that we can actually facilitate a conversation to talk about to get your identity initiatives more recognition, more funding, unify the business behind an identity initiative, et cetera. So I think it's a really, really cool conversation to have. So let's look at an example here. And these aren't real examples. They're kind of, not real companies, but they're representative of real data. So we already talked about improving customer registration and how it's the business's job to get people to the registration page, but it is the identity department's job to get people through the registration page. So business, pays massive ad and marketing budgets to get people there, but if they fall off, then those are lost customers. So let's look at a couple of examples: takeout pizza and retail banking. So if you look at takeout pizza, right, this is, you've all ordered takeout pizza before probably. Let's say they have 60 million digital customers who are ordering online, right? 60 million who prefer to order online. And their year-over-year growth of that customer base, even without identity in the picture, is 5%. So they're gaining 3 million new customers a year. And then their abandonment rate for registrations are 20%. So that's 600,000 customers a year that they are not getting because people are abandoning the registration process. Now, maybe some of those are calling in and ordering instead of going digital. We actually have numbers in our real calculator to account for those types of things that you can agree on with the business. But this is just a rudimentary example, so I didn't want to get too in the weeds. But then we have identity recapture in the next row. So the question that answers is how much of that could SSO, social registration, improved UI UX, a better registration solution, how much of that 20% could we win back? If we can recapture just 2% of those 600,000 customers, I'll have to do some quick math. I don't have the number here. Was that 12,000? Then sorry, I have a little animation built in here. I spent so much time getting these effects. There we go. It is 12,000. Sorry, it is calculated for me in the results. So yeah, 12,000 new customers that you can recognize a year, right? That's a big deal. Each of those customers are associated with revenue and customer lifetime value. So it's a big deal. The same for retail banking. Let's say 700,000 digital customers who bank online. 10% of those they gain through year-over-year growth. So 70,000 customers a year just without identity in the picture. But then 40% of those, 28,000, they lose via abandonment in the registration process. If identity could win back just 15% of that, my animations aren't working with me today. It's ruining my dramatic effect. There you go. 4,200 additional customers that they would gain a year. And by the way, I'll give you an example. Each of those numbers is associated with revenue. I already alluded to that earlier, but if we, for example, ask what's the lifetime value of a customer for the takeout pizza place? Let's say that customers typically stay with them for 15 years and order $5,000 of pizza before they quit eating pizza or go to another brand or whatever. So the customer lifetime value is $5,000. That means that 12,000 customers is worth 60 million. So that's a significant impact on revenue. And you might say, holy goodness, 60 million, that's a lot of money. I can't go in there and say that. But the fact of the matter is as a percentage of their revenue, it's not that big. At the end of the day, you're going to be able to show how identity can tick up their revenue by 1-2%. And it helps if you talk through this simple math, because these numbers are not numbers that you bring to them. They're numbers that they bring to you. And you might have to agree on the identity recapture rate, but stuff like that 2% is pretty conservative. And depending on what your registration process looks like right now, you may adjust the number and depending on what it might look like. But for the most part, these are numbers that the business has that they bring to you, and the math is not complex. So it shouldn't be terribly surprising to them when you see a number like $60 million in revenue that's going to take your overall revenue of the company up by 1-2%. So let's look at another example, and this one's around improving sign-on. So a couple of use cases here: retail shopping and ebook sales. So again, we talked about how identity helps improve sign-on. Sign-on is equated with a value, right? Each interaction is equated with an average value, and businesses have this information already. So if a customer identity solution can make a smoother sign-on process that reduces abandonment, well, that's more interactions, more revenue that you're getting that you didn't have before. So retail shopping store, let's say they have 100 million sign-on attempts, and those are different from customers. These are like sign-on attempts, each of which is worth something to them. They have sign-on abandonment of 10%. And each visit on average is worth $35. So what that means is that 10 million abandoned sign-ons are worth 350 million lost dollars a year. So again, the recapture, right? You have to agree on this with your business, but let's say if we can recapture 20% of that 10%, that's 2 million sign-ons a year. And that equates to $70 million, right? So a big number. And a big impact that customer identity can have. Ebook sales, 30 million annual sign-on attempts, 21% sign-on abandonment, that's 6.3 million. The average spend per visit, so the cost associated with each of those visits is $3. That's 18.9 million lost because of that abandonment. And if we can win back just 10% of that 21% lost abandonment, then that's 630,000 additional sign-ons, and gosh, these animations aren't going well for me, and $1.9 million dollars in revenue. So some big numbers. Last one. This is the last one that I'll kind of show you a table like this. So I don't want to. When I was making this chart, I got a little bit mathed out, so I don't want you guys to suffer the same fate. Entertainment industry and hospitality. So this has to do with improving cross sells. So again, cross sells we talked about, that was the example I gave where all of the channels share a common set of preferences, and those preferences can be leveraged by any other channel to make meaningful cross sell and upsells. So let's look at an entertainment business and think of something like Amazon Prime, right? Something that streams videos, that has multiple channels, and that has upsell opportunities, things like being able to rent a movie or something like that. So if they've got 10 million customers and 7% of those 10 million, so 700,000 of them are avid users who use multiple channels. And then if you ask the business, how much, if we had a consistent set of preferences, do we think we could be successful with cross-sell and upsell opportunities? And this is again a number you have to work out with your business, but say 2%, 14,000 customers. We could successfully upsell 14,000 customers. And the additional cost of a cross-sell or upsell is 80 cents. And then those customers visit on average 300 times a year. So if you crunch all those numbers together, you get $3.36 million extra in upsell. Hospitality. So again, obviously this business is not as booming right now, but I have faith that it'll come back. So picture a hotel chain, and 141 million customers, 18% of them are avid users of the mobile app and different channels, 25.38 million people. And 4% of those, you've agreed with the business that if you had better cross-channel preferences, you could upsell them more often. That's just over 1 million people. And then at $10 a cross-sell and an average of 6 visits a year, that means that you can earn 60 million.9 additional cross-sell revenue for that hotel chain. And again, these seem like big numbers, but keep in mind that these are smaller percentages of their overall revenue. So these are the types, they may be surprising to us as identity professionals, but these are 1 to 2% of the numbers of total revenue. And it stands to reason if you just kind of run through this math that, wait, maybe identity can have that kind of effect. Maybe we can tick the revenue up by 1 to 2 to 3%. So here's another example, right? Think about support calls. Let's say you got 100K customers that call into support each year. And then because of, having to remember verbal passwords, PINs, knowledge-based authentication, or multiple authentications. I don't know about you guys, but the multiple authentications, maybe it's because I'm an identity guy, but it drives me up the wall. If I have to register to an app, click get support in the app, and then authenticate with the robot lady on the phone, usually very inconveniently. And then the person answers the phone and asks me, okay, I need to authenticate you. I'm just like, oh, come on, guys. You've done this twice. And if I'm already frustrated with the company, which I often am if I'm having to call support, that could be the thing that sends me over the edge. And in this example, it is that thing for 10,000 customers, for 10% of those that call into support. Well, what if we could do a simple authentication where, they could just send a push notification or even share a session with the app that they push to get support from. So the support rep can say, how are you, instead of who are you, for the third time. You might be able to do something like reduce that abandonment to 2% and retain 8,000 of those customers, which obviously, as we talked about, are all associated with customer lifetime value and annual revenue and all the annual visits and everything that comes with it. So stepping back and looking at it a little bit more broadly, we talked about loyalty and trust and things like that earlier. Creating better customer experiences that drive loyalty is a thing that drives revenue in itself. So here's a stat on the screen that shows that those customer experience enhancements for multi-billion-dollar companies can equate to $258 million in revenue solely from customer experience improvements. Now, identity can't claim all of those customer experience improvements, because if you think back to that slide I showed you where we look at the whole picture, there's web design, there's mobile app design, there's all sorts of things that contribute to customer experience, which is a very broad term. But identity definitely plays a role, right? Personalization across channels, sign-on, registration, those processes that can really frustrate customers. Getting those right can claim a portion of this. Same thing with privacy, right? And trust, building trust. 83% of customers want tougher regulations and penalties for privacy. 66% of enterprises say their customers demand stronger privacy and security. So this is what I was talking about when I said I wouldn't have put privacy in there a couple of years ago, but now people are recognizing the value of privacy with things like GDPR and CCPA and Cambridge Analytica, right? It's becoming more top of mind for consumers. So being a good steward of customer data, complying with these regulations helps to build trust. And again, that trust helps to build revenue. So I alluded to this number earlier, right? How much are loyalty and trust worth? You might say, well, those things are all kind of arbitrary. You're talking about moving the needle for the business and assigning specific numbers. Well, Adobe says that loyal customers spend 67% more than new ones through repeat purchases. So there's a number, right? At least a starting point. And you and your business may play with that number. You say, you know what, well, I think Adobe's overshooting on this one. I think loyal customers are going to spend 10% more or 50% more. It doesn't matter, because that's a number that you guys can agree on, that we can put into our customer value calculator and spit out a number. We can say, hey, you know what, if we enhance customer experience, we think we're going to create X amount more loyal customers. We're going to facilitate, 10% of customers through that user journey to advocacy. And those 10% are going to spend 67 or whatever number you agree on % more. And that equates to more loyalty and more revenue. So all of these things, it's not just any one of these things that represents the value that customer identity can provide. Rather, it's all of these things. All of these things come together to create really, really big value for customer identity, right? So it's a really, really important conversation for you to be able to have with your business. And at Ping, we have recently developed, and it's actually launching, I think on Friday of this week or early next week, a business value calculator that takes this methodology that we've just talked about and provides a nice visual, medium for you to kind of put in some of these variables and spit out, what total value is customer identity going to provide? How is it going to help with customer acquisition and customer retention and interactions and building trust and cross sells and things like that. So it spits out all of these numbers for you, just for you to get a look at what does, what is the value of customer identity in my organization? And, of course, beyond this, we made this for the web. So there's a lot more in the underlying formulas than our input fields on this calculator. And so certainly we'd be happy to talk with you offline if you want to really dive in and really cater the numbers specifically to your organization, so you could see, so you can see what the value of customer identity might look like for your organization. So this will be, like I said, this will be coming in the next few days. We'll make sure to send you a link to it whenever we've got it, because I'd love for you all to try it out and if you like, have deeper conversations with you about how does customer identity provide value for your business. So that's it. That's the presentation today. In summary, identity drives big value. It does it by helping you acquire more customers, creating more customer interactions, and influencing cross sells, building trust and loyalty, which equates to revenue, retaining more that call into support, delivering better experiences, all of these things, right? These are things that you can talk to your business about. These bullet points, businesses will say, yes, I want to do those things. And the best part is that we can prove it. We've got formulas. It all ties back to numbers. We can put numbers in and we can show you how it's going to move the needle for your business with some real tangible hard numbers that are custom to your business to show you the impact customer identity can have. And that in turn, like I said at the beginning, is going to get you more recognition. It's going to help you unify the business behind the identity direction that you want to take it. It's going to help you potentially get more funding, and just more support in general from the business, and more recognition. So I think it's a really, really cool conversation to have. So that's all I've got today. I'd be happy to take some questions. I think you guys can type them into there's a question box somewhere you can type in questions. I'm happy to answer them. I know we're a little early, so if I see a few questions coming in. If there are more, I'm happy to answer them, or I can also give you some time back if you like. So let me go ahead and take one of them there. And maybe this was, I kind of alluded to this, but this is a real concern. It says, I'm afraid of getting laughed out of the room walking in with this big of a number. Maybe that was asked earlier in the presentation when I first popped up some of those big numbers. And it says, how should I manage a conversation around this business value? Candidly, I thought the same things. When I was going through this, I helped craft all the math for this calculator. And when I was going through it and I saw the first numbers that it spit out, like 60, 70, 100 million, I said, no way. Like that's, I mathed something wrong. So I went back and I just ate away at bits and pieces of the math. And it really does work, right? The math is really there. What I found that you can't do is enter the room and say, hey, customer identity is going to save you 60 million bucks. You should support me, because yes, that is going to immediately, the optics of that just don't sound right. But if you say things like customer identity can improve our revenue by 2%, or if you start from zero and say, let me show you how customer identity can improve our revenue, and you kind of walk through the numbers, get the numbers from your business and work through it with them, then it's not as jarring when you walk in with a giant number. So, yeah, I think I would recommend highly against walking in with the results or shooting a blind email to your CDO or whoever, that this is the impact customer identity is going to have. It really requires an explanation. And of course, like I said, we're happy to help you walk through that conversation if you like. Other questions, got a few more. Who do I validate these numbers with, my organization? Yeah, so who do I talk to? Where do I get these numbers? So business side of the house, sales, marketing, CDO, I mentioned earlier, chief digital officer, GMs, product owners, potentially. Those parts of the organization are thinking about things like abandonment, how many new customers via registrations do they get, basket sizes, all of that different stuff are already numbers that they have. So those people, if they're not the exact right one, those types of folks should be a good starting point to reach out to and point in the right direction. Other questions, let's see. So, okay, so this works for organizations that have insight into customers and their buying behavior. If I look at banking or healthcare, does that model adjust for industries? So I've tried to make this model, and we've done a lot of work to make it industry agnostic. I've even worked with some strange industries, like mortgage lender who has customers once and they log in and authenticate once and they get their mortgage, and then that's how they make their revenue, and then they may or may not come back again until they buy another house 4 to 10 years later. So that was an interesting model, and through trials and errors like that, as we were building this, we tested it with a lot of different folks, and we've come up with a pretty common format where the variables can be adjusted for most scenarios. That being said, I did talk to a customer the other day who told me, I don't care about revenue, that's not our objective. And I said, well, I don't know if this business value calculator will really help with that. But aside from those rare cases, it's pretty easy to adjust. And even if it's not, we'd certainly, again, be happy to talk with you, and we can even adjust the formulas or adjust how we think about certain things to deliver the numbers that are more bespoke to your organization and your scenario. Okay, let's see, we've got another one. What about cost savings? Is that factored into your calculations? Yeah, so cost savings is really not in this iteration. We do have a calculator that calculates for workforce identities. And that one is more focused on cost savings and TCO. We may add it to this, to our model at some point in the future, because it's certainly there, right? It saved call center interactions, saved resources from managing, legacy systems versus upgrading to a new system, things like that. Just the cost of server space to make stuff more modern, right? There can be cost reductions with that. So there are definitely a long list of cost savings, and we have a calculator for that on the workforce side, but it's just not built into this customer one right now. Part of the reason is the top line revenue generation really outweighs the cost savings by a lot. It would be like having a conversation where you say, yeah, we're going to generate you 60 million of revenue and save you 50,000 in cost savings. Not that it's not relevant. And certainly from an IT perspective, an IT executive, that may be even more relevant. But we just started out with the top line revenue because we wanted to facilitate a conversation with the business. That was kind of the original goal. But good question. We might definitely add that type of thing in the future. And in the meantime, we have a workforce calculator that looks at that type of cost saving stuff. So I got another question. In a manufacturing industry where digital services are value added propositions and not a part of the primary product offering, how would you calculate the value of branding, innovation, et cetera? Say for an auto manufacturer whose digital audience is primarily dealerships. Yeah, so I think I would equate this to banking, right? So when we've looked at banking examples before, and the customer don't spend money directly with them, but they collect fees from the customer, right? So I think this is an area where I'd be interested to see your thoughts on if the inputs in this calculator are relevant to you. But if they're not, we could certainly look at it and say, we can make distinctions and say, okay, well, the customer experience and the value and the branding might increase interactions or have an effect on these things that go into the customer lifetime value here. Or we might have to go as far as to, if this is one of the industries that just doesn't fit as well with the calculator, then we could of course go and modify it. But I found that even in industries where the customers aren't spending directly with the business who's gaining the value and using the calculator, that you can still make associations between the types of enhancements that identity can make and the value that ultimately ends up coming to the organization. But that's something I'd be happy to chat with you about. I don't know if I personally have done a manufacturing example. We have another business value kind of expert who that's his full-time job at Ping. I kind of created this calculator and then handed my baby over to him. So he may certainly have had some manufacturing specific experience. I'd be happy to connect you. So that's all the questions. Unless there's anyone wants to lob anything at me, last minute, then I am happy to give you 15 minutes back. And yeah, please reach out to us. Be on the lookout. We'll send you a link for that business value calculator so you can try it out for yourselves. And please don't hesitate to reach out. Mark, who asked that question, that last question, and or if anyone else wants some kind of a specific discussion with us about how to cater this calculator more specifically for their business. But overall, even if you don't use this calculator, keep these conversations in mind. They're really, really good conversations to be able to have with your business. And I always say identity is a thankless job, right? If you're not doing it right, if you're doing it right, then nobody notices it because people don't come to your sites for identity. But these types of conversations are really the way to up the value and up the perception of identity within your organization. I've seen companies do it, and it has really, really nice effects for the identity function in the companies if they're able to do that. So reach out if you have any questions. Check out the business value calculator. We'll send to you shortly once it's live. And thank you guys for your time today. I really appreciate it.